Hello and welcome back to the channel. Many moons ago in sociology class in medical school, we discussed the topic of medicalization of life. Like nutrition, doctors get very little formal education on sociology and such. I think that class on sociology was only one of 3 or so that I had in 6 years of medical school. I had only one class on nutrition. But anyway, this one class of sociology made a big impression on me. For one, it was a pleasure to just sit there in class and just leisurely discuss life issues and not trying to understand a complicated biochemical cascade with 1,000 components. Our professor talked about how birth and death have been increasingly medicalized, such that the majority of births now happen in a hospital. By the way, this is a good thing. I'm not arguing otherwise. After all, in developed countries, maternal mortality is way lower than in countries where birth is not particularly medicalized. Everything in between birth and death is also medicalized to within inches of its life. To add to this point, in my present capacity as a Swiss GP or family doctor, if you're in the US, I spend my days explaining to the Swiss invalidity insurance why Herr Schmidt or Madame Chevalier or Signora Bianchi cannot work anymore and deserves an invalidity payout. But what struck me most on that day in sociology class was this. The professor asked, what good has come of the medicalization of life? That was a very good question, actually. And the best answer I heard on that day came from a pal of mine. We're still friends to this day. He said, medicine has rendered life more humane. I have thought about this answer of his for years now. I've never forgotten it. I think my friend hit the nail on the head. In many developing countries, you still see frankly mentally ill people roaming about the streets, often abandoned by their families who are ashamed of them. In the West, such people would be cared for in a mental health institution and would have a clear diagnosis and obviously a treatment plan. When I look at old black and white photos of people being gawked at in Victorian circuses, those freak show circuses where people with certain disabilities were paraded around for money, I can often diagnose them just by looking at them, what we call a spot diagnosis. These diagnoses include things like acromegaly, where someone is born with or acquires too much growth hormone, and they end up with not just gigantism, being very tall, but also they have distinct facial features and big hands, which we describe in medical parlance as spade-like. One of the villains in the James Bond series clearly had acromegaly, and no doubt was cast for exactly this reason. I can't remember right now what the name is, but I'll put it up on the video as it plays. Often, people with achondroplasia, otherwise known as dwarfism, are also put on display in such freak shows and circuses. Maybe also people with Down syndrome, although I'm not quite sure about that. I haven't really seen many people with Down syndrome displayed in such circuses from the Victorian age. Anyway, some of these so-called freak show subjects are harder to diagnose and would require additional analysis and not just looking at photos of them or looking at them themselves. One such person who was very, very easy to diagnose was Joseph Merrick, otherwise known as the Elephant Man. And he was quite a phenomenon. In fact, I believe there's a film about him. I mentioned him in the video on top 10 hospitals in London. I shall put that at the end, in the end screen, so you can see it if you haven't seen that video. Because I put him there because he is one of the claims to fame of one of the London top hospitals. I shall let you discover which one. The Elephant Man had a specific diagnosis called Proteus syndrome, which is a more recent diagnosis, I believe, which was posed in the 1980s. But before that, it was thought he had a neurofibromatosis, where you get many tumors, unsightly bumps growing all over the body, quite unsightly. Now, I get that the freak shows were a way for these disabled people to earn a living. But in all honesty, wow, what a way to earn a living. Not to talk of they were probably exploited as well, in a way that prostitutes are exploited by their pimps. I can quite imagine how life was like in those times for people, such unfortunate people with these disabilities. Anyway, I digress. To get back on topic, we don't have abandoned people on streets or paraded in freak shows these days. Why? Because whatever their physical problem is, it is diagnosed and treated, and we all understand it's a medical issue, and we respect that. It is not about an unknown, which is probably the problem back in the 1800s in Victorian times. And therefore, we are not fascinated by it anymore. It's nowadays known whatever a person is suffering for, in most cases anyway. So that fascination with the unknown is no longer there. So we don't need freak shows anymore. This is an important point. We are fascinated by the unknown. And this brings me to my next point, the whole point of this video. Because paradoxically, we are all witnesses to the biggest freak show ever in 2024. It's worse than any freak show that Joseph Merrick would have been subjected to in England, and also I think he went to Belgium to participate in these kinds of circuses there back in the 1800s. What we are witnessing now is the freak show to end all freak shows, the mother of all freak shows, because this one is on a global scale, and it's one we get to watch 24/7, literally in the palm of our hands. This freak show is also being deliberately fed to us, the public, by the star of the show herself, who happens to be the medical victim. We can't make this up. We all agree that the spectacle of Ms Markle is off the charts. In many ways, it's not her fault. The internet was not around when her predecessor, the Duchess of Windsor, walked away with the abdicated King of England in 1936. Despite the pleas for privacy, we have anything but privacy from her and her husband, Prince Harry. With this video, I hope to make the case that the question as to a serious neurological problem underlying Ms Markle's seemingly brazen behavior is anything but an impertinent one. It's anything but an impertinent question. I'm here to pose the medical questions. My whole channel is: what symptoms do people have? How can we address them? How can we diagnose them? And how can we treat them? I'm curious as to behavioral issues, physical symptoms, problems. As we say in German, Beschwerden. This is my particular interest. It's a professional interest, of course, but it also happens to be a personal one for me. I'm just curious about medicine in general. Now, with my medicine is humane mantra in mind, I present the growing evidence that what we see as outlandish behavior may well have a true medical origin behind it. And as such, whatever we may think of the person, first of all, let's separate the person from the medical problem. And secondly, with the possibility of a potentially devastating diagnosis in play, let's see the suffering of the person in a new light and try to do what we can to help. So we separate the problem from the person, and then we try to address the problem. We as individuals are of course helpless to do anything to help a global personality such as Meghan Markle, but we can choose to witness this freak show we are witnessing and process it in a different light from how others process it. This, of course, is not to say that we should ignore or condone the behavior. I am British. We, the British, we are smarting, of course, from the consequences of Ms Markle's behavior on our beloved late Queen and her gallant, lifelong consort and husband, Prince Philip. So this is particularly hard for us Brits. I get it. But let's do our best to be as objective as possible. And for me as an individual, especially on this channel, I shall try to be as professional as I can, given that I am posing questions as a medical personnel. So let's dive into this. I think we have all arrived at the conclusion by now, given the continuous feed of events and incidents, shall we say, that are being fed to us by the media and also other sources, that whatever behavioral challenges Ms Markle exhibits are quite challenging, to put it mildly. If she really is a narcissist, and yes, there's a lot of compelling evidence to conclude such, then we cannot describe her narcissism as simply narcissistic tendencies, I believe. I think it's a full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, because it is highly destructive, causing a wave of devastating destruction after another, just like a tsunami actually. Note that I said it is highly destructive, the behavior. I am not targeting the person. I'm trying to use her case to discuss a range of personality problems, in this case narcissistic personality disorder. And I'm trying to put a face to the disorder. In a sense, it makes it easier for us to relate, especially the viewers, the audience, to relate to the problem. Because if it's all abstract, if I say person A has this, it's not very interesting. It's not very relatable. So, just considering the link between a narcissistic personality disorder and mental health issues in general, here are a few study evidences, as I promised. In one study that I found, and I shall put this up, narcissistic personality disorder was believed to affect around 6% of people worldwide. And it's more prevalent in younger people actually. Now, how do we define young? I suppose less than 40. However, narcissistic tendencies are associated with other types of mental health issues as well, according to this paper. Number 1, depression. Contrary to what I personally believed, a 2020 study found that narcissism contributes to persistent and intrusive negative feelings, which in turn increase the severity of depressive symptoms. We tend to think of narcissistic people as brazen, unempathic, arrogant, etc. But underlying all of that are serious insecurity issues and negative feelings, depression. I'm learning all of this. I'm not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or neurologist, but of course, I come across a lot of patients requiring these skills, and I am learning as I treat these patients. Obviously, I don't get to treat all these patients myself. I send them to specialists who know more about these things than I do. But I learn along the way. Anxiety is another one. In general, narcissists crave acceptance and acknowledgement. They need fuel. Consequently, they may suffer from intense anxiety about being humiliated or rejected. And because they often struggle with relationships, people with narcissistic traits may be more prone to social anxiety. That might explain why social media addiction is associated with both anxiety and narcissism. Okay, it corresponds to what we see, to what we know instinctively. I completely agree with this. PTSD and narcissism. One study found that trauma survivors who showed higher levels of narcissism were also more likely to develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder. Some mental health professionals see narcissism itself as a PTSD response resulting from childhood trauma. So, childhood trauma is an issue. Now, not only do certain personality disorders manifest structural problems, but of course there are factors that collude to create the problem in the first place. There's a lot of talk about Ms Markle enduring some sort of childhood issue. Her mother wasn't present for a while. That is quite traumatic to any child, I would imagine. I don't want to delve too much into the personal life of anyone I talk about on this channel, but it's out there in the mainstream media. This could well play a part. The fact that we have the internet has blown up her behavior into a global phenomenon. Normally, if she were Ms. M living in her quiet street, her quiet community, her quiet life somewhere, we wouldn't all know about this. So a lot of factors collude to create the problem. It's a mishmash of factors, some biological and some clearly not. So, a perfect storm, one would say. According to research, people with narcissistic personality disorder have reduced gray matter volume in areas of the brain related to empathy and increased activity on baseline images in brain regions associated with self-directed and self-absorbed thinking, specifically the insular cortex and the frontal lobe. So just now delving into the brain abnormalities that are identified in people with narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. Another study published in Nature. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Nature is one of the premier journals in the world on medicine. This study shows that there are structural changes in the prefrontal cortex in patients identified as having narcissistic tendencies. Note that these are not necessarily patients suffering from narcissistic personality disorder, which I would expect to show even greater structural differences as compared to the norm. These are patients who are just showing narcissistic tendencies. So even if it's only a tendency, there are still brain structural abnormalities. Imagine in the disorder, I would imagine there will be more. Another study published in the journal Brain Sciences again points to the frontal lobe as an area of the brain where there are clear structural changes associated with self-absorption. The left anterior insular region of the brain, which is thought to be involved with cognitive functioning and the regulation of emotion, has also been tied to the generation of compassion and empathy. The researchers found that the degree to which a person was able to exhibit empathy was tied to the volume of gray matter in the brain, both in the group of healthy individuals and among those with narcissistic personality disorder. The findings suggest that regardless of personality disorders, the left anterior insula plays an important role in feeling and expressing compassion. Next, the researchers intend to investigate how the volume of grey matter in the cerebral cortex affects the interplay between various regions of the brain. The researchers will use functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a technique to measure brain activity based on cerebral blood flow, to study the functions of the left anterior insula and how the brain's various networks differ in patients with narcissistic personality disorder. It's not just one region or brain location that is responsible for empathy, says one of the researchers. There is an interplay of regions in the brain that all participate in the, shall we say, correct behavioral patterns associated with normal social life. Another study that I found, this time in the Journal of Psychiatric Research, also points to the insular cortex. Relative to the control group, NPD patients had smaller volume in the left anterior insula. Independent of group, grey matter volume in the left anterior insula was positively related to self-reported emotional empathy. Complementary whole brain analyses yielded smaller grey matter volume in frontoparalympic brain regions comprising the rostral and median cingulate cortex, as well as dorsolateral and medial parts of the prefrontal cortex. And the conclusion is, here we provide the first empirical evidence for structural abnormalities in frontoparalympic brain regions of patients with NPD. The results are discussed in the context of NPD patients' restricted ability for emotional empathy. Emotional empathy being one of the hallmarks of narcissistic personality disorder, of course. Now, I don't know about you, but I see a pattern here. The neurodegenerative disorder I discussed in my last video, known as frontotemporal dementia, FTD, which is known to manifest significant narcissistic behaviors, targets the frontal lobe as well. Connection? What wouldn't I give to persuade Ms Markle to get into an MRI brain scanner? Maybe we could pull this off? She took a genealogy test, and she found she's 43% Nigerian, Can someone convince her she needs to conclude the Nigerian thing to see if her brain is also really 43% Nigerian? Anyone? Jokes aside, what can be done with someone with such grave and destructive personality tendencies and who is willing to undergo some kind of treatment? All the patients who underwent scans in the studies above were persuaded to do so that is possible. But investigation of the problem and even diagnosis are one thing. Treatment is another, obviously. Would we get the same cooperation with regard to treatment from a person suffering from narcissistic personality disorder? And what kind of treatment options are there anyway? All pertinent questions. My next video will be a foray into the dark crevices of the distorted mind. I will focus on possible treatment modalities and how successful or not they may be. In the meantime, stay healthy, and as usual, any thoughts, comments, or ideas are highly welcome. Go on, ask a doc.